Great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Gunjan, and with me, I have Neil. Hi, Neil. How are you? Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh,
Good
there
to
you
see
can't even see my cup.
you.
How's
Great.
everything going with you today?
Great. Weather is another nice summer day. We seem to be lucky on these recording
Absolutely.
days. So, yeah, beautiful day.
A lot of sun, a lot of summery days. So looking forward to that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, after that cold April, I'll take it.
Absolutely. We don't get enough of that. So
Indeed.
it's been a while since we've actually recorded a data projects video. So maybe we could start with a bit of a recap if you don't mind, and then we could introduce the topic for today.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. So in the original data projects video, I explained how a data project is a project that sort of spans that business IT chasm. So it needs both the business and IT to be collaboratively successful. That's a lot of IT projects. So the distinguishing criterion is that it also involves either data in large volumes or um, a lot of historical data. And there's sort of three risk factors with data projects that set them apart as well. The first is data gatekeeping, which we spoke about in the last episode. And today we're going to talk about data connoisseurship
Right.
or lack thereof, which can be a risk. And in the next session, we'll talk about what I call this Tower of Babel situation, which is kind of like a mismatch of skill sets and language and even thinking patterns. But we'll
Right.
get to that in the next session. So today I want to talk about connoisseurship in general and data connoisseurship, and what I mean by that.
Absolutely. Let's get started with that.
Sure. So what is, okay, it's kind of it sounds like a fancy word, connoisseurship. It's obviously French in origin. I think it goes back to the early 1700s. According to Merriam-Webster, it's defined as an expert, especially one who understands the details, techniques, or principles of an art and is competent to act as a critical judge.
Hmm.
So the example they give is like a connoisseur of music.
Right.
The story that I like to talk to of a good friend and former colleague, Mark Burchell, the way he kind of explains connoisseurship as it pertains to what we're going to be talking about today is he gives the example of cuisine in England and Britain. And he points out how if you go back to the 1970s or 1980s, cuisine in England was kind of a joke. The stereotype was, like it would be like a boiled fish, no
Yeah.
flavor or too much salt.
I'm
Um,
remembering meat pies, wasn't there? Or maybe I'm remembering the movie, the barber movie with the meat
Meat
pie.
pies are actually probably the better side of the cuisine. I'll give meat pies some credit, but um, overcooked food, overcooked vegetables,
Okay.
overcooked meat. And so what began to happen in the 90s is the cuisine changed quite a
Hmm.
bit. And if you go there now, they have some of the top Michelin star restaurants in the world.
Interesting.
And
Well,
so what drove that change? And what Mark points out was it wasn't really a top-down decision from anyone, from businesses or government to bring in better health standards, or it was not a top-down decision by fed up chefs who are like, I've had enough. I will give the people some fine food. Like there's nothing like that happened. What happened was the British essentially got wealthy and they went traveling, and they went to
right.
places like Thailand and India and
Mhm.
Morocco and China and all sorts of other places, and obviously Europe as well, and France and Greece and Italy,
Right.
and so Lebanon maybe, and they come back and they're saying, "Oh, I went to Lebanon. I had these amazing falafels. I went to Thailand. I had this amazing pad thai. I went to India. I had these incredible curries and butter chicken. Like, why can't we have this here?" And so now you go to Marks and Spencer's, and all that stuff is there. Like,
Right.
if you go to, so the restaurants are there, so people are asking for it. And so the point he's trying to make, that I agree with, is that it is a kind of a bottom up transformation
Right.
that you don't necessarily have control over.
Right.
And so it's also really kind of hard to put your finger on. In the case of food, it mostly comes down to taste and preferences. So you're like, well, does it even really matter? And I would say, yeah, it kind of does, because I think that these other foods are also healthier too.
Right.
But if you look at something like architecture, you could say, well, that's sort of taste and preferences. But architecture has a functional element to it. And so you can, if you go into an old building from, you know, the 1800s or something like that, the ceilings feel very low. There's not good lighting,
Right.
tons of tiny little rooms. Now there's much better lighting. Things flow more
Yep.
naturally. It's more
Open
functional.
concept, all that kind of stuff.
Right, exactly. So I think it's hard to nail down the specifics around connoisseurship, other than to say that there is kind of there's something going on there that I think is tangible at one level and intangible at another.
Right.
So what do data projects have to do with connoisseurship? Well, I've sort of broken it down into two different dimensions. So the first is the trickier of the two, and that is the technology platform, the tools we use. How do we select those tools? How do we select that technology? And that plays a role in terms of the success of data projects.
Right.
And it's also something that is incredibly complex. It's inherently complex. And it's also something that doesn't really happen very often. Namely, meaning that you don't, when you do a large scale technology platform selection, that's kind of a once in a 2 decades, or at most once in a decade type of decision. So I don't want to address that one first. I actually want to address that one second. The other dimension that impacts the success of these data projects from a connoisseurship standpoint is how we gather our business requirements.
Right.
Because most of the time when projects fail, it's because the business requirements were not properly validated. So what I want to talk about now are those two challenges. I want to talk about the challenges around gathering business requirements.
Right.
Because that's something I think, if you listen to what I'm saying, you can actually apply that and bring about better outcomes. And it's something that a project manager or an architect, or even somebody who's just a worker bee, if they understand these concepts, can kind of drive projects to better outcomes. Whereas the technology and tool platform selection is a little bit harder to really put in a box. But I still want to talk about it, though.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the business. Can we talk about the business requirements?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, and what it really comes down to is there was this professor at Trent University. I can't remember his name, but a really clever guy. He taught about project management. He liked to say, the secret behind all project management is the F word. He pauses and he says feedback. And I agree. I couldn't agree more. And what he's really saying is that you can talk about the agile method or the waterfall, but at the end of the day, it's all about getting feedback. And if you're not getting that feedback fast enough and you're not validating it, then you're going off in the wrong direction, and that's where failure happens.
Right.
So why is this happening? So I don't think that's a controversial thing I'm saying here. I think everybody would say, yeah, of course you need feedback. Who would argue with that? And yet I still see it on an ongoing basis as a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's sort of two patterns that I've noticed happening again and again and again. And one is kind of the fault of the business, and the other is the fault of the technology folks.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're both, in some ways I shouldn't really even say it's the fault of the business, the fault of tech. Like, they're both kind of blended together at some level. But let's talk about the business issue first. So what I've noticed is a lot of these data projects involve building out some kind of set of either reports or dashboards or a self-serve reporting solution that you can answer questions around. And so this is really where it's important to get the requirements right, because the requirements are kind of unknown, because when you're trying to build a report or a dashboard or self-serve, really what you're trying to do is build a decision support system, something that people can ask and answer questions and then get factual answers so that they can make clear-headed decisions. And these reports and whatnot, at best, what I often will see is some system that just ends up being like a glorified data extraction engine, where they just find the report and they just download to Excel and then they start getting to work, which kind of, I wouldn't say defeats the purpose of what they're doing, but it didn't really accomplish what they were doing.
Right.
It only got sort of part way there. So that's often an outcome. Another outcome is that they just don't get used at all. So why does this happen, and how is the business in some ways responsible for this? And I think it comes back to the fact that there is this concept that's known as bike shedding, where people get caught up in the superficial details and they sort of ignore the substantial things that are really important. And so I'll give you an example. I often will see, and I'll explain where this term bike shedding comes from in a second. So I'll often see, like, I'll develop some kind of report or a dashboard, and which is designed to answer a bunch of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say just a simple thing, we're just tracking, comparing budget to forecast to actuals in finance, something like that.
Right.
And there's going to be questions about, well, how does it compare to last year and last month and so on. There's a lot of typical things, but there might be more complicated questions.
Yep.
Yeah, you might have a more complicated question like, are certain types of departments have more problems in terms of keeping on track on their budget than others? And you can get into those more interesting questions. But here's what often will happen is the person looking at the dashboard will actually not look at any of the actual numbers or data.
Right.
And they'll just focus on how the dashboard looks. And they'll say, the color scheme here, it doesn't really look good to me. And this number format, why do you have like...
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's like skin deep feedback, right? As opposed to actual content, actual meat of it.
Mm-hmm. It feels very superficial, especially when you have spent 90% of your time trying to get the data clean and accurate, right. And you feel that you've lifted these heavy weights, and nobody can see anything that's happened and all they're doing is they're picking on these things that really are unimportant. So what's going on there? And I think it's important to understand the psychology here. And if you look in Wikipedia, there's an article on bike shedding that you can read. It's also known as, I think it's called Parkinson's Law of Triviality. And really it comes back to this, I guess his name would have been Parkinson, but at any rate, somebody back in the 1970s attended this town hall meeting, and there were a few items on the agenda, and one was a nuclear power plant, and the other was discussing this bike shed. So the mayor brings up this nuclear power plant and says, this power plant is going in, and the approvals have been made, but we still want community feedback, and we want to know what you guys have to say. What do you guys think about this nuclear power plant? What should we do about it? And everyone kind of looks around like this and just, I don't know. Right. And then they move on to the next time. Okay, next item is we're going to be building this shed in the town square. You can lock your bikes up there. It should protect them against the elements. Any feedback? Anybody want to say anything about the bike shed? First hand goes up. What color is the bike shed going to be? Second hand goes up. How will the doors work in the bike shed? How will the hooks work in the bike shed? 20, 30 minutes goes by. They finally conclude the conversation about the bike shed. Our friend Parkinson walks out of this meeting kind of bewildered, thinking to himself, hold on a second here. We just spent all of 60 seconds talking about a nuclear power plant that is going to have massive ramifications for this city for years to come. And we spent half an hour talking about a bike shed. What the heck was that? And after some reflection, he kind of came to sort of two insights. And the first is, nobody really knew how to grapple with the nuclear power plant. Nobody knew what questions to ask to begin with.
Yeah, it's further away from the user, right? They're much closer to the bikes because they can touch it, feel it.
Exactly. Yeah. And had there been somebody from the nuclear power plant there that was like an advocate of the town, he could have said, hey, you might want to ask about safety provisions. You might want to ask about warning systems. You might want to ask this question. So there was no advocate for those people in that room.
Right.
The second problem was that most people are good and want to help and want to contribute. And so the only way they know how is to comment on the bike shed. So they don't want to walk out saying, I'm not a good citizen, I didn't do anything. They want to walk out and say, I did something, I contributed. And so they'll nitpick on this bike shed.
Right.
And so unfortunately that dynamic though plays out a lot in the technology world, where people feel that they want to contribute, but they actually really don't know how. And so they'll just pick on things that they understand, but ignoring the sort of the substance.
Yeah, and to your earlier point, right, that's where you mentioned project management, program management. I see that that's where it's really important for that individual to understand all the aspects of that particular project, right?
Yeah.
The various data points that are involved, the various technologies that are involved. Because if some of the things get brushed under the rug, so to speak, if they don't come up, then encourage that discussion in polite ways, right? Let the SMEs speak, but at the same time, encourage them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, as much as I have told people about bike shedding and I think
right.
about it and I try to kind of nudge people in the direction of thinking, sometimes it's impossible. And sometimes people like it's called the information bias, if you know about cognitive biases. And
Hmm.
people have in the back of their mind, they're like, I'm just going to wait until everything is absolutely done before I really give my feedback.
Right,
So it's like, you don't need that color to change or that font to change or that number formatting change to give you the feedback. But there is something part of your mind that is telling you that, wait, let's just wait till everything is done and then I'll give you my feedback.
right,
And, that's really on them to not do. And I'll say, look, this is not on our critical path. Like when you start using this, you're going to find that it may or may not answer your questions. I don't know. I've tried to do my best to figure out what kind of things that you think about, but only you will know for sure.
right.
And as much as I've tried to nudge these people, some people are just like, I'm sorry, man, it's 5 o'clock. I'm going home. Goodbye. So, I don't know what to tell you other than like, don't take it personally, I guess is really what I can say about that. And this sort of explains some of that. But there's also another problem that I see at the same time. And in fact, the bike shedding one is not that bad. I find actually the IT side is as much their own enemy. And the reason I say
Mhm.
that is often I will get bogged down in these others. I see people getting bogged down in these projects, building all sorts of layers and
Right,
infrastructure that isn't actually needed to validate those requirements. So again, I cannot emphasize enough that everything will live or die on those requirements. And IT often has this, they talk a lot about potential
right,
and this kind of field of dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come. And so
right.
they're kind of like, don't worry about it. As long as we set up this infrastructure, like it'll be easy to make this change or that change at the right time. But the important thing is to have all these servers and layers and, heavy data. We have to build a data warehouse and an ETL infrastructure and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah, 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 blah. And it's like, but the business doesn't see any of that being made, or they don't
right.
really care. And
Well,
you've
they
just
don't
spent
know
all
the
this.
impact of it, right? So you've made a decision possibly on their behalf without their
Mhm.
input, which is a big kind of hidden risk there.
Right, but it creates this huge amount of momentum that even
Right.
I can't often do anything about. And so I'll get involved. Project manager will be like, okay, Neil, you got to check, you got to make sure that the data warehouse is working, this is working, that working. I'm like, well, has the customer validated this? Oh yeah, we had a feedback session. It went great, but of course it was just a bike shedding thing. And I'm like, okay, is it substantial? Like, have they like tell me about this feedback? And they're like, don't worry about it. It's in a document somewhere. And what I realized is that the feedback actually was superficial, and the project manager feels like, I need to check boxes. This is my job. I've got tasks.
That's
I got
what
to
I was
finish them.
thinking. Yeah.
We have a project plan. We have a project charter.
Yeah.
Um,
Because
get
at the
to
end
it,
of the
Neil.
day, there's KPIs, right? And there's the ironic thing that I find is the KPIs are identified at the start of the project and then never revisited because it's like a
Mm-hmm.
line in the stone, right? It's like, well, we talked about it in the project charter and it's done. We
Yeah.
can't go back and update that. And that probably contributes to the issue because now you have a pace to keep up.
Yeah. So how do you avoid this?
Yeah.
There's kind of two things that I try to do. Is I say, first of all, and this is another thing too, about the bike shedding. I always try to make sure I'm using real data.
Right.
The second you use mocked up data is the second that people just check out because they know that there's nothing there. But you use real data, and
Yeah.
especially if you can find an insight that they didn't already know, then you can capture their attention. So this is what I'll try to do. I'll say, all right, I'm not an expert in finance, or I'm not an expert in marketing or whatever, but I know just enough that if I can look through this data, find something peculiar, and
Mhm.
activate their curiosity, I can get them into this positive feedback loop.
Right.
So the more you can get that real data, you can say, hey, did you know that you have these customers that they're women between a certain age and they seem to only shop in these times and they seem to buy tons of this product. This is
Right.
fascinating. And they're like, really? Well, can you tell us if it's also true for this other? And then you can get people thinking about the data and not getting bogged down into the um, the superficiality. But again,
Right.
a lot of people, especially the architects who are involved, don't feel that's their job. And that, oh no, we have a voice of the customer who do that for us. And that voice of the customer isn't necessarily doing that. They might be focused on the UX as well, and even they themselves can get sucked into bike shedding. So that's one
Right.
thing you can do. The other I can't emphasize enough is understanding how long people's attention lasts for, and I think it doesn't last for more than about a week.
Hmm.
So if you're not getting a feedback cycle where you're checking in once a week, then people kind of forget what was going on, and you lose momentum, and then you're just kind of re-ramping up all the time.
Right.
So, I worked with one group many years ago where they were they understood what I was doing, but they were like, we're doing what you're doing already. I'm like, well, how quickly are you getting feedback and implement? They said, well, once a month.
Mm.
And then, but then I drilled in further, and they said, yeah, our customers are kind of, they've lost faith in us, and they go back to using Excel and these other things. And I said, well, I want to get you in a once a week feedback cycle, because then you can keep their attention. And I think that's about as long as you can go. In fact, you can once you get going in that once a week cycle for 2 weeks, you can get into a daily cycle after that too. So your goal is start with once a week, and the more you can narrow that, and that often involves letting go a little bit and allowing the knowledge workers to talk directly at each other instead of having to go through all these layers of PMs and whatnot. And the more you can get that kind of cycle going where the people at the lower levels are talking directly to each other and not throwing requirements over a wall, then you can get again into even tighter feedback cycle. So that's the name of the game, is getting into this super tight feedback cycle. And if somebody's saying, but we have to build this automated infrastructure, I'm like, yes, if you have Slack over there to do it, go for it. But if it's going to impact this tight feedback cycle, then you're putting your own project at risk.
So when you're talking about feedback cycle, are you talking about the release time or?
So data projects often, they don't necessarily have the requirements is discovery is everything. So when you're talking about a release of a report, really what the release time would imply would be an automated refresh of that data in a production system where there are controls in place so that people cannot go willy-nilly start mucking around with the report. So once you move into that kind of production environment, then that implies that you have a separate development environment, and everything kind of starts to slow down from that moment forward, because you have to go through these controls, promotion from dev into prod, all that good stuff. So what I'm saying is, you don't want to be moving yourself into that world until you've got something that is useful for the business.
Okay, that's fair.
And once it's sort of useful for that business, then what they will crave is stability. Because if you stay in that kind of volatile situation for too long, then you'll break things, and they'll kind of, I'm worried about what you've done here. So there's a bit of an art there, is to understand, when have I got things to a stable enough point where I can move things, and so the requirements feedback that's coming back is going to be diminishing, meaning that, oh, can you just add this little thing or that little thing, and they'll be okay if it takes a week, because they already have a stable system. But if you start to put everything into this highly productionalized, highly layered system too soon, then it can sort of calcify, and you put yourself into a bit of a straitjacket. So that's really the art. And again,